Long time since March. March was the last time we were together, and I've missed this. So this is our 59th, I think, session of the History Club, coming up on 6 years in January. So again, I appreciate your interest and Pam's patience in putting up with me as I get ready for these things every month. Okay, we have up here what we have been doing since we did our restart in January 2017, and you'll all remember, those of you who have been here for some time, remember that this is the sequence we've been through. We started back in the Stone Age and have worked our way gradually to the point now where we're past the Middle Ages. Remember, the Middle Ages, as far as history is concerned, end in 1500. So we are post-Middle Ages, and we are working on absolutism in Europe, which is the period after the end of the Middle Ages, going up to maybe 1750 or 1800, where we have absolute rulers as monarchs of European countries. And so we started that in March. It's a three-part little series here, and we talked about France and Spain in March, and I'm going to do a little bit of a review of that before we get into what the topic is for today, which is Austria, Prussia, and Russia. We'll go through those three, and then next month we'll complete this series with England. A lot to talk about in England with all of their first civil war and all the rest of that goes on. So bear with me as we start out here with a short review of what we did in March to get us up to speed with France and Spain, and then we will continue on then with Austria, Prussia, and Russia today. So, remember in Spain we talked about Isabel and Ferdinand, these two cousins that married, that brought the kingdoms of Aragon and Castile together, unified Spain, and we talked about their accomplishments. Major accomplishment was defeating the Muslims, being the last of the rulers of this 500-year effort of the Spanish to drive the Muslims out of Spain, and so they completed that in 1492. Then had the cash available to send Columbus off, and so they sent Columbus off, and that established Spain. Then, of course, is the imperial power in the Americas, and of course also had their part in English history by dispatching their daughter Catherine to be the queen for Henry VIII and the first of his 6 wives, and we talked about them a little bit in the springtime. They are also the ones that start to unify Spain as a Catholic country. The Muslims are now gone, and they are unabashedly Catholic, and they are set, not as much as their grandson will be, but set on making Spain a Spanish country. They are tolerant of Muslims and Jews. This is before the Reformation, so there are no Protestants yet. But they are tolerant of Muslims and Jews more than what their grandson, Philip, will be. As I said, I'm not talking about every single ruler of these countries. We're just kind of hitting the high spots as we go through. And so we skip the next ruler, which is Charles, and go to their grandson, who is Philip II. And he is fortunate enough to be the ruler of Spain when all of this gold and treasure starts coming back from the Americas. And he becomes, without a doubt, the wealthiest person in Europe because of all this money coming back. They actually have established, and we talked about this when we did the Age of Exploration, this 20% tax of everything that comes back to Spain. He gets 20% of it. And so that's a pretty big cut of a lot of money. So he becomes very wealthy. He is more fervently Catholic than his grandparents were, or his dad, and so he ends the tolerance for the Muslims and the Jews. If you're going to live in Spain, you are going to be a Catholic, and so as a Muslim or Jew, you either converted or you were forced out of the country. So that is the period of time in history when Spain becomes solidly Catholic. He is also the one that has a conflict with England. You might remember when we were talking about Queen Elizabeth and Mary Queen of Scots trying to become the Queen of England. It was with Philip that Mary Queen of Scots had her conspiracy to have Queen Elizabeth executed so that Mary Queen of Scots could take over as the Queen of England. He had also married for a short time Elizabeth's older daughter, Mary, in an attempt to gain the throne of England through marriage. But Mary turned out to be such an onerous person that he said, even England isn't worth me putting up with this woman. So he divorced her and decided to try to assassinate Elizabeth or wait, and so that didn't work out for him. He's also the one, when we talk about the defeat of the Spanish Armada in 1588 by the English, it's Philip's Armada that has been sent to overthrow Queen Elizabeth. So when that Armada is destroyed, and it is virtually, we talked about that earlier as well, the Spanish control of the seas, which they had established, because they're going back and forth all the time, carrying settlers to the New World, bringing gold back from the New World, that when this Armada is defeated, that's what establishes Britain as the primary leader of the Atlantic, and that's what opens up the colonies to England, and that's why it's after 1588 that we have Jamestown established and Plymouth shortly, after the defeat of the Spanish Armada. So that's Philip. So we have this time when Spain is the dominant power in Europe, mostly because of its control of the Atlantic and two, because of its extreme wealth. But their downward trend starts with their defeat by the English and the fact that they lose control of the seas. Okay, we went to France next, and I made you the same promise I promised my high school kids. There are a whole bunch of Louis in France. And I said, there's no way that I'm going to have you remember what Louis VIII or Louis VII, whatever. But there are some Louis that are more important than others. And one of them is Louis XIV. Of course, he's the son of Louis XIII. Remember, we talked about him. It's Louis XIII that had Cardinal Richelieu as a regent when he was young and couldn't take over, and it's Cardinal Richelieu that figures so large in the Three Musketeers saga as the bad guy. And so when Alexander Dumas writes the Three Musketeers, he has Cardinal Richelieu in that book as a bad guy. So anyway, Louis XIII passes away. Louis XIV comes in. He's 5 years old when he takes over. And you can see the years that he ruled up there, 72 years. It is the record, currently still stands as the longest ruling monarch in history. Of course, it helps when you take over when you're 5 and you live to be 77, which was a very unusual age back then. And I think I mentioned to you now that, Queen Elizabeth II of England, it's in May of 2024 that she will, and as honorary as she is, she'll probably make May of 2024, that she would then become the longest ruling monarch in European history. So anyway, when we talk about absolutism, it is based upon the concept of divine right, which we talked about in March, meaning that God picks in the womb of the Queen who is going to be the next ruler of this country. And it is God's will that that particular individual, Larry, not Glenn, Larry, is picked by God, all right, to be the King of France or the King of England or whoever it might be. And then God rules the country through that person. So that's the concept of divine right. It is the foundation for this absolute rule. Because all of the countries of Europe during this time are going to be Catholic or shortly Protestant. And so the role of the church, certainly the Catholic Church in this, as partners with these monarchs, encouraging these people to believe that God has picked this person to be their ruler. Because the church above all wants stability. They want to know that the tides are coming in. And so anything they can do to make these rulers more stable is going to be to their benefit. Not only all power rests with him, but all power to affect what goes on with other countries is going to rest with these rulers. I am the state, so when Louis says I, he means France, and when people say France, they mean Louis XIV. And so that's the kind of power that he wields. And it was pretty well known that he spent lavishly. He never wore clothes twice. And so when you look at these kind of outfits which were typical of him, he only wore them once. So if you have these kind of outfits and you got one every day or two a day or however many he chose to wear, his wardrobe budget would have been enough to bankrupt a small country, let alone France. So he's going to die. He lived so long that his son is not his heir. His grandsons, 2 grandsons, are not his heir. And it's his great-grandson that finally takes over. He's going to be Louis XV. We talked about him briefly. He's going to continue the lavish spending of his father. His most famous things that he spent were horses. He had like 200 carriages, and it's like Jay Leno's garage. You know, you've got all these carriages there and all the horses that go with them, and so he's going to continue the spending. So while France is a powerful country, they've got an army. We're going to see them in a second fighting some wars with some of their neighboring countries. You only have so much money. And where does this money come from, for France anyway? The people, it's taxes. You know, Spain's getting money from outside, but France really isn't. You know, when they go to America to set up colonies, they're mostly there for beaver pelts, and because they're not going to be bringing gold back. And so that's not going to be the kind of, so all this money that these guys are spending, it comes from the people. And more spending, Versailles and some of the other building projects, the people are just going to finally get tired. So when we left France, we left them on the verge of the revolution. And here, I guess maybe in 3 months, 3 or 4 months, if we can continue doing this, we're going to get to the French Revolution. French Revolution, a peaceful affair? No. One thing, you know, people try to compare the French Revolution and the American Revolution. And one thing I usually say is that we didn't have people parading around with people's heads on stakes in the American Revolution. So there's a level of violence that's always associated with the French Revolution that fortunately, even though we had a war, we didn't see in the States. Okay, so let's go on to new territories. You know, I did this block, and when you teach high school history, you are required to have different, you know, benchmarks. There are certain things that you have to cover, and guess where the kids are going to see these things again? At the state mandated test, you know, the end of the year. So you got to make sure that you push these buttons. And so when I first started out, you know, I did that. I was still telling all these stories and everything, which sometimes my department head got irritated with me when I said, no, we're having fun in the classroom, and I'm not going to stop having fun. And so, anyway. But anyway, there's nothing in the book about Hungary and Poland. Because Hungary, there isn't just a whole lot going on in Hungary and Poland unless you live there. But its impact on the history of Europe is not that great because they were mostly stepping stones. I mean, if you wanted to go, like if you're the Mongols, and you want to go from Russia into Europe, you got to go through Hungary and Poland. And if you were the Vandals and you wanted to go into Russia, you had to go through Hungary and Poland. So they're basically stepping stones here early on. There just wasn't a whole lot going on there for me to mention. Well, I was called to task on that by a foreign exchange student who was from Czechoslovakia. And she came up to me when we got through this block, and she said, sir, I was waiting for you to start talking about our countries. And I said, well, I'm sorry, you know, there just isn't a whole lot going on in your countries. It's not that, you know, you're not important. Technically they weren't at that time, but didn't want to hurt her feelings. But I said, okay, I'm going to put them in my block of instruction, put them in my lecture. There they are. Okay, so any of you who are Eastern European fans and wonder what's going on in Hungary, Poland, what used to be Czechoslovakia, or what is today Czechoslovakia, there it is. That's my one slide, all right, for Hungary and Poland. So hopefully all you Eastern European fans are somewhat mollified. Okay, Italy. Italy was important after about 1200 or so, for about 400 years. You know, the Crusades, a lot of the Crusaders went through there, and Italy became rich on their money because a lot of Crusaders, when they went through Italy, Italy had banks because of their trading thing, and so a lot of Crusaders left their money in Italian banks and went and fought in the Crusades. Do all those Crusaders make it back? What happens to their money? The bank gets it. All right, so some of their money was coming from Crusaders' pocketbooks because they just didn't survive. The other thing is that they are the end point in the Mediterranean of the Silk Road, which comes out of China, goes through Constantinople, and then up and through Italy, and then through the rest. So when Italy and Portugal, not Italy, Portugal and Spain and Holland especially, not Spain, Portugal, and Holland figure out that they can go around Africa to get to India, to bypass the Silk Road. All that trade that used to be coming through Italy, not all of it, but most of it stops. So they lose the trading money. England starts growing a lot of sheep and start making wool textile industry, or the wool textile industry in England really blossoms, and it takes money away from the Italians. The Catholic Church, we've had the Reformation in the 16th century, and the Roman Catholic Church was used to tithes coming out of all of these Catholic countries in Europe and feeding into the Vatican, into the Pope, and about half of that goes away. So there are several reasons that Italy loses income that they had been having, and they become a much less dominant force economically than what they had been previous to the Reformation, certainly. Okay. Gosh, I've talked for 15 minutes, I haven't talked about a war yet, really a significant one, so it's time to do that. You know, we have all these numbers going on. We'll talk about the 7 Years' War today. How long do you think 7 Years' War lasted? Now, this is a question I usually ask Mike Burke. You know, we talked about the 100 Years' War before. Mike Burke, you're on. How many years did the 100 Years' War last?
160.
Thank you, Mike. What a good student. He's a terrific student. Whenever I ask that question, I know he's going to answer it correctly. Thank you, sir. All right, so we talked about the 100 Years' War earlier between France and England, and so it lasts 116 years. 30 Years' War actually lasts 30 years, so that's, you know, that makes it pretty easy. This is a religious war between Protestants and Catholics. It happens after the Reformation, about 100 years after the Reformation, and there was severe conflict. You know, Martin Luther is from technically what is Germany, even though he was in a principality of Wittenberg when this happens, but it's technically Germany. There are about 360 different principalities in what we would call Germany at this point in time. And some of them choose to go Catholic, and some of them choose to, or stay Catholic, and some of them choose to go Protestant. Well, at this period of time, you can see up there in the 17th century, 1618, the Protestants rebel in one of these principalities against their Catholic rulers because of the taxes the Catholic rulers were placing on the Protestants that they weren't placing on the Catholics. And so there are a bunch of good old boys, you know, probably Protestant rednecks in Germany, that show up at the county courthouse and throw what we would call the county assessor out the window, and he dies on the pavement before. Well, the Catholics are going to take exception to this treatment of their tax collector, and so the war breaks out. So this is to determine, supposedly, whether or not Catholic, or whether Germany, all of these principalities are going to be Catholic or Protestant. And so this is what the 30 Years' War is about. It actually turns into a war of who is really going to control Europe. Because France, does France like Germany? No. No. So France looks to the north and they see this turmoil going on, and they see we've got an opportunity to exploit this and weaken Germany, because they were concerned about these 360 principalities uniting as one and causing France problems. And so France comes in on the side of the Protestant rebels because they want to weaken Catholic Germany. Sweden and Denmark also come in on the side of the Protestants. So we have the Protestant rebels supported by France, Sweden, and Denmark. Spain sees their Catholic, and, you know, very strong Catholic country. They see the Catholics needing support, so Spain comes in on the side of the Catholics. And they fight for 30 years. And it's a very bloody fight. This is probably the most, if you see in a history book that's honest about the portrayal of this particular war, this is going to be the visual that is most often shown there. If you were a Protestant and the Catholics came in and took over your village, you're going to end up hanging from a tree. And if you are a Catholic and the Protestants come into your village, you're going to end up hanging from a tree. It was a very brutal fight by two religious groups. And it's one of the fights, it's kind of like the Crusades. When people say, you know, Christianity's bad, look at the Crusades and all this. This is another one that you could point out and say, Wasn't the Sandhill or Christians fighting each other and doing this kind of thing to one another, but that's exactly what happened for this 30-year period. Some of the effects of this, 1/3 of the population of Germany perished in this fight. Wolves, the kids in my high school class were fascinated by this, that wolves started to come down and roam the streets of the villages. They'd been pushed back by civilization, but they came back to prey on people because of the weakened state. And a requirement on the Catholic side was that all priests shall marry. They don't have a choice. The Catholic Church orders them to get married and have kids. And a man may have 2 wives because there just weren't that many men around. And to make sure that the women were able to procreate and produce more kids in this population decimated area. So, we have what is called the Peace of Westphalia. This is a classic Jeopardy kind of question, you know, the Peace of Westphalia. So this is the treaty that ends the war. And they basically agree to disagree. They fight for 30 years, kill thousands of people in sometimes despicable ways. And what they end up with is what we could have told them was going to be the end result, the best end result. You 360 principalities, you choose what you want to be. All right? You can choose to be Catholic or you can choose to be Protestant. But in the end, France gets what it wants because they now have a separated Germany. It's not a united Catholic country anymore. It's one that's broken up into all these principalities. So France is a winner in this war, and it's going to elevate them to being a leading power at that point in time. And Germany is not going to be unified as a country until 1870. So it's going to go through, what is that, 200 and some odd years, 222 years of disunity before it becomes the Germany that we know to be the Germany today. Okay, so let's go to these rulers. Prussia. Frederick the Great, nasty little son of a gun. This is a guy who has a Napoleonic complex before there's Napoleon. You know, Napoleon comes along in the early 1800s, and so this guy precedes him. But a fellow of rather short stature, always wears a uniform. Everyone in the army had to be 6 feet or taller. He's allowing some guys who are 5'10" or 5'11", but I mean, it's going to be a physically imposing place. And he's going to build an army that is going to enlarge Prussia. I'll show a better map. Let me get to this map here. This map here. When he takes over Prussia, Prussia is this. That dark green spot that's up here. When he gives up or he dies, this is what Prussia is. So we're talking about mostly Germany and Western Poland in today's context is what he ends up at. He's homosexual. When he is a youngster, a prince, he runs off with a boyfriend, and the dad, who of course is the ruler, sends the army after him, and they bring him back and go to the basement of the palace, and the dad chops off the guy's head, you know, the boyfriend's head, and forces Frederick to watch this. And they believe that this so embittered him that he internalized this. He didn't take it out on these people, didn't assassinate his dad or do anything else like that, but he was just an embittered man, you know, for the rest of his rule once he takes over. Takes it out mostly on other countries, becomes an empire builder, and doesn't produce an heir. There's no offspring, and so they have to scramble at the end to find out who his ruler is going to be, or who his heir is going to be. And one of the people he took advantage of is Maria Theresa. Perhaps one of the more famous of the Habsburg rulers. Of course, those of you who have been on tours and you go to Austria, you know you can't take a step without seeing something about the Habsburgs. And because they ruled for what, 640 years, 645 years. So of all those Habsburg rulers, she is one that is held to be the most famous because she is considered to be an enlightened ruler. Enlightened means that you appreciate, you don't get up in the morning. Most of these people who are absolute rulers get up in the morning and say, what can I do for me today? And an enlightened ruler is going to be one of those people, just like we have enlightened leaders today, that walk up and say, what can I do for my people today? And she's one of those kind of people. So she's going to rule for 40 years. She's going to have 16 children, 10 who live. This is a famous portrait of her family. If you count all the little kids here, there are 10 of them. And the most famous of them is the youngest one, sitting right here in this chair. It's a she. And who is she? France, Marie Antoinette, who she is going to send to be the Queen of France at an unfortunately untimely period in French history, because of course we're going to get to this in like 3 or 4 months, but it's Marie Antoinette that's going to have her head chopped off with Louis XVI in the French Revolution. So that's the little girl whose mother does not anticipate that to be the fate for her daughter when she says, yes, you may go be the Queen of France. But anyway, Frederick looks at Austria and says, it's a mere woman ruling Austria, I can take her. So he attacks Austria, and it initiates what some people consider to be the First World War. It's called the 7 Years' War because it lasts for 7 years. It is initiated in Europe, but it also takes place in India and in North America, same 7-year period. Called the French and Indian War in the United States, or in our colonies, and it's a fight in India between France and Britain about who India is going to be a colony for. So he perceives her as being weak. Again, this turns out to be a fight between a bunch of European countries. Austria and France France and Russia are going to come in on Austria's side. And when Britain sees that France has joined with Austria, they're going to come in on Prussia's side. Anytime France, for a long time, 800 years, anytime France and Britain see an opportunity to weaken the either, they're going to take it. And so that's what happens in this case as well. So Frederick's going to win. He's going to take land away from Austria, but the results in the others is that Britain is going to take American colonies away from France. France is kicked out of North America. We'll talk about that in about 2 months. And then Britain gains India as a colony as it kicks out France from India as well. France is on the losing side of this one, and this is going to be the feather that breaks the camel's back. The French Revolution is going to start in 1789. Which is, what, 26 years after this. The French people just get sick and tired. They say, we keep losing these wars. And you're spending all this money, and we don't see, all we see is our taxes going up. And so that's what's going to spur on this French Revolution and the bloody results of that. Just kind of a note here. It used to be in the old days, the king was out fighting with these guys, swinging a sword and lance and all the rest of that. Well, the last king to actually fight on a battlefield happened in this war, and it was the King of England, George II, who fought in a battle against the French. And that's be the last time that a ruler actually stands on the battlefield and sheds blood for his country. So that's the passing of an era. Okay, let's go to Russia. We'll finish up here with Russia. Interesting characters in Russia. I know some of you have been there. Pam and I were there 10 years or so, I guess. No, 8 years. No, 10 years. Whatever. We were there in Russia. Boy, what a interesting place. How many in here have been to Russia? Been to Russia? Okay. Goodly number of you. Good. The thing that impressed me about that is the same thing that happened to them in history. You see proof of it on the ground. They're behind us. They're behind Europe. They're behind us. Economically, structurally, their internal infrastructure. I mean, it's just, to be in a modern country as big as what they are, and with as much money as they have in that country, to be where they are today is just fascinating to me. And that started 800 years ago, when the Mongols under Genghis Khan came in and took them and held them subservient for like 300 years, 400 years. In that period of time, when he isolated Russia from Europe and all of the advances that were going on in Europe during that time, Russia fell behind, and they haven't caught up. And it's quite evident when you when you go there today. All right, so let's talk about a couple of rulers. Ivan the Terrible. Does he look terrible? Can you imagine? You know, I put myself in the shoes of a suitor that shows up wanting to date some girl, and this is the guy who answers the door. I cannot imagine. Anyway, so he becomes the ruler at 3. So I've already mentioned this a couple times. You know, Louis XIV took over when he was 5. Do these guys actually rule when they're that young? No. Remember that word regent, that somebody is picked. Sometimes it's their mother. Sometimes in Europe it was a Catholic cardinal, like Cardinal Richelieu, Cardinal Mazarin for Louis XV, are chosen to act until they come of age, 18, 21, whatever they feel it is. So he has a regent. But anyway, so technically he becomes the ruler when he's 3. His dad had died. He went out on a horseback ride, got a boil on his rear end, got infected, and he died. So it's kind of hard to imagine that would be a cause of death today, but it was back then. Even with the best medical attention that you can get in Russia. I'm not sure that medical attention in Russia was all that great, but that's what happened to him. So why is he known as the Terrible? First thing is that there were some Tatars, that's another name for the Mongols. Still some Mongols hanging around, and he, without mercy, eliminated any remaining Mongols, Tatars, from the Russian landscape. He also massacred a large part of the noble class. The word for the noble class in Russia is boyars. He had a wife, her name was Anastasia. He had selected her from the 2,000 young maidens that were presented to him as candidates for his wife. So he was very much in love with her. She died at a state dinner, poisoned. And of course, we believe the poison was intended for him, but she got the wrong plate or whatever, and she died. And so Ivan basically executed all of the nobles that were at that state dinner. Saying, I'm not going to worry about trying to find out who's guilty here. I'm just going to kill all of you. You know, which is basically what he did. He will have 6 more wives. This is a demonstration, historians believe, of the love he had for Anastasia. He has 6 more wives, but there are no more offspring presented. They feel they were mostly political unions, no love in any of them. But the thing that kind of caps him as the terrible is that he killed his own son. His son, of age to become the heir, had a wife. She was pregnant. Ivan, by story, comes across her and walking through the palace. She has on a revealing outfit. She has a revealing outfit. He doesn't like her. He hits her, causes a miscarriage. The son comes to the dad and said, basically, Dad, you shouldn't have done that. And basically, Ivan says, well, I can't if I want to. Swings his staff at him, hits him in the temple, and kills him. And unfortunately for the son, he's now dead. Unfortunately for the father, he's going to carry the remorse of this act for the rest of his life. And unfortunately for the country of Russia, there are 2 other sons, and they're going to be incapable of rule. The best ruler, probable ruler that could have done the best for Russia is lying dead, bleeding out on the rug here in the palace. So Ivan didn't do his country any favor when that happened. The one that's going to take over is Theodore, and he is generously called mentally challenged, offering basically little leadership for the country. So we're going to have, when Ivan dies, we have this period of 30 years where we have this turmoil about who really is the ruler or who isn't the ruler. They're actually, during this time, which is fascinating, well, one of the sons had his throat slit while he prayed in the church, and we actually went to that church when we were on our tour and went into it. They have a little plaque showing this is where this guy had his throat slit while he was praying. The other mentally challenged, Theodore, he takes over for a while, and there are actually 2 rulers, 2 guys who come from Poland at various times. They're called the false Dimitris that come in and try to rule Russia. Because there's no one to stop them from coming in and ruling Russia. So they sit on the throne for a while. One is assassinated. Well, both of them are actually assassinated. Interestingly, the second one, people are so upset with him, they cremate him, and then they take his ashes, and they take a cannon to the border with Poland, and they put the ashes down in with the gunpowder, and they shoot him back into Poland. Shoot his ashes back into Poland with his artillery piece. So, very creative when people are pressed to be. I think I said all of this. I think I've told you. This is the church northwest of Moscow, where the first son had his throat slit while he was at prayer. Now, so we have this 30-year period after Ivan dies. It's called the time of troubles because Russia is basically rudderless. There's no one in control. And so the noble class finally gets together and they say, we got to have a ruler. And so they turn to the Romanov family, who was one of the leading families at the time, and say, you pick. Who will let you pick whoever you want, whatever man in your family. And they pick 15-year-old Michael Romanov. And now you can imagine, you just think about your family. And if you looked around at the menfolk in your family, and it's a 15-year-old young man who was chosen, you got to know that kid's got some potential, or at least he's viewed in the family as having considerable potential, because that's who the family offers up. And so Michael Romanov becomes the first of the Romanov leaders. And they're going to live for 304 years. So, all you who are good at math, you can add 304 to 1613, and what do you get? 1917, which is the year of the Russian Revolution. So who is the last Romanov ruler? Nicholas II. And so obviously we'll get to him at some point in time in the future. Okay, Peter the Great. Got a lot of greats going on here during this period of time. I pretty much guarantee I will go to my grave without the great ended on my name. John Troutman may be different. It may be John the Great by the time that happens, but
he is great, Uncle John.
No,
and there's no argument.
Yeah, no argument. We go about 60 years before we have someone that we are going to call a significant Romanov ruler, and it is Peter the Great, 10 years old. When he is younger, he has an older brother named Ivan. And this is at a time when the Russians do not care to have a female ruler. So Sophia, fine-looking woman, is the older sister. And if you go, into the Kremlin in Russia, they actually have this setup where these are the two thrones, and then there's this curtain behind here with another chair behind here. So the story is that Sophia, because she felt she was old and responsible, would sit behind this curtain, and the two boys, the brothers, would sit up here in front, and when the affairs of state were discussed, she'd whisper what the right answer was to them. So she was actually the ruler, whereas these guys were co-rulers at this point in time. Ivan, the older brother, dies. Peter takes over, and as was the case with anything back then, if you wanted to get rid of your wife, your mother, your sister, where did you do with them? You sent them to a convent. And so that's where Sophia ended up with other wives who were discarded. It's an interesting concept to me that there are some nuns out there that are simply nuns because they were cast off by their father, by their husband, by somebody. So, interesting concept to me. 6'9", so obviously that's very tall for today, but it's very tall for back then. Very coarse taste fruit. He enjoyed after dinner belching contest. You could become a good buddy of him if you could win the belching contest after dinner. He favored himself to be an amateur dentist. The last thing people of the court wanted to do was admit that they had a toothache, because that meant that you were going to go under his knife and pliers and he'd take care of you. Perceived his son Alexis to be a weakling and constantly harangued him to the point that Alexis ran off. And Russian army goes after him, brings him back, and his dad tortures him to death. Literally, personally tortures him to death. Out of frustration and, of course, proof of his belief of how incapable he thought of him of ruling. But the one interesting thing that he does is that he recognizes that Russia is behind Europe. And he says, we have to figure out, if we are going to be a strong country and be able to compete and stand with Europe, we got to find out why they're different than we are. And so he disguises himself. Now, he's 6'9", and he has about 20 guys that come after him to take care of him. So I don't know how effective his disguise was, but that history records that he disguised himself. He actually worked as a longshoreman in Holland for a period of time, to try to understand what was going on with Europe, to make them different from Russia, and how can Russia catch up with Europe. Well, so he comes back. It may have been insightful to go to Europe to figure out what was going on there, but the lessons that he brings back are not constructive to Russia. The kind of lessons he brings back is, no one in Europe is wearing a beard. So all of you Russian guys, beards are now illegal. And if you want to have a beard, there's going to be a beard tax. You got to pay a tax to have a beard. Do the Russians want to cut off their beards? Why? It's cold in Russia. The other thing, he comes back in and he says, no one in Europe is wearing long coats like we wear in Russia. They're all wearing coats that come down to the middle of their thigh or something. So now all Russian coats are going to come to the middle of the thigh. Do the Russians want to give up their long coats? No, because it's cold in Russia. So these are the kind of ideas. So at the base, you know, all right, let's go learn about Europe. But the things he brings back are not going to be popular with the people. So this is called, he's opening a window to the west. And also part of this is going to be him relocating the capital to what is going to be called St. Petersburg, because it's closer to Europe, and especially after he gains access to the Baltic and get there by ocean. So he's going to defeat Sweden. That gives him access to the Baltic. If you remember, those of you who have been with us the whole time, the one thing that Russia lacked geographically was access to a piece of water that didn't freeze in the wintertime. In the winter, their navy goes nowhere. And you can't be a world power unless you can get a navy out of your ports all year long. So they were always after a warm water port. Now, a port on the Baltic may not seem warm to us. It's not Cabo, all right, on the Baltic. But at least it didn't freeze. So they were able to get out into the North Sea and then to the Atlantic. So that was a big thing for him. Establishes an army with a 25-year term. If you, in our times of draft, how many years were you drafted for? 2. 25 years is the term of service if you were drafted during that period of time, and probably not a popular mandate. Okay, shaved face, short coats became the civil, or became the standard. So what are going to happen to these ideas when he dies? They're going to go away. All right, that's a, you know, it's always a measure, I guess, of the leadership or of a leader in any kind of organization, military, civilian, it doesn't matter. That when you leave, if they continue the programs that you established, that is a compliment to your leadership style. If everything has changed, you say, I guess those weren't popular ideas, or they weren't effective, or whatever it was. But for him, when he dies, all of this goes away. All right, he is going to move the capital. All right, we got Moscow here. He's going to move it up to St. Petersburg. This is the access to the Baltic Sea that he gains. So where the Neva River flows into the Baltic, there's a swamp with 19 islands, and he built St. Petersburg there. It cost the lives of 200,000 workers during the period of time that it was built. So obviously dangerous, unhealthy kind of conditions. It's been renamed several times. So when it's named St. Petersburg. When World War I starts, who is Russia's enemy? Germany. St. Petersburg sounds like what kind of city? German. We can't have that. All right, we're fighting the Germans. We can't have our capital city sound like it's a German city already. Sounds like we've lost already. Well, the war ends, and they're going to name it. They're going to change it back again because it's named Petrograd. After the war, Russian Revolution, Lenin comes in, and so they want to rename it now for Lenin, so it becomes Leningrad. And then in 1991, when everything collapsed, they said, well, no, we don't want to name it for Lenin anymore, so it goes back to being St. Petersburg. So St. Petersburg, Petrograd, Leningrad, all the same place. Just named because of the difference between or their political situation. Okay, Catherine the First. We're going to get into two interesting Catherines here to wrap this up today. Peter's first wife, or his wife, was Catherine. She was a peasant woman in a village that was occupied by the army. And she became famous for her feminine charm, shall we say. And it turned out to be the mistress of some of the soldiers. So popular that when this particular unit relocated back to the capital, they took her with them. Her talents became known to the officer corps and in the noble class, so she kind of worked her way up as a mistress through the ranks. And finally, at some social function in the company of a noble, was introduced to the ruler and to Peter. And they fell in love and got married. 12 kids, 2 of whom lived to adulthood. After Peter died, she took over and she ruled for a couple years. Now, it's during his time there in St. Petersburg that the Winter Palace was built. And those of you who have been to Russia have seen this, and it's remarkable to me again that it's proof of how wealthy Russia really was back then, but where all of that money resided, and it resided with the royal family. For them to create this structure with this kind of luxury and all of the gold and everything that's in this palace is just, and to see what's going on around it, even today, and then walk into this place and you say, well, you got to be kidding. Why are we spending all of this money on this royal family when the rest of the infrastructure of the country is just bollocksed up? Private theater, of course, sitting rooms, entrance to the garden. I mean, all of this stuff is just ludicrously expensive. This device here in the lower left-hand, many of you probably saw this in the tour of the palace. That's a clock. It's a solid gold peacock contraption. This is the reception hall. And the rulers would sit here. This is Catherine. We'll talk about Catherine here in just a second. We'll wrap it up with her. And she would sit here, and she had a private entrance or exit out of here that went straight to her bedroom. And we'll talk about the reasons for that here in just a second. Okay, so let's get to Catherine the Great. There is a series, and I forget who, I don't know if it's Amazon. Somebody has a series called Catherine. It has Helen Mirren starring as Catherine the Great. It's decent. And I kind of recommend it to you. It does get a little bit soap opera-ish, and rightfully so, because she is a soap opera. She's a German princess, again, married at 15 to Peter III, who is Peter the Great's grandson. She, after a period of time, figures out that he's really a weakling, and she thinks she can do a better job. So she seduces a couple of army officers and wins their support, and they conduct a coup, and they overthrow Peter, put her on the throne, put Peter in the prison, and forget to feed him, basically, and he dies. And so she then takes over as the ruler. So we are dealing with a woman here who had tremendous ambition and was ruthless in getting what she felt she had to do to achieve her goals. Peter was upset. This is one of the reasons she was able to win the support of the people. Peter was a Lutheran, and the country was Orthodox Christianity, so there was a religious difference. Peter is disliked by the serfs because of the taxes that he is charging them, and the army doesn't like him because he wants them to go conquer Denmark, and they don't want to go. Why do we want to conquer Denmark? So she takes over. But the thing about Catherine that is absolutely infamous, and the Russian people almost take pride in this, is absolutely morally corrupt. She does not marry again, but she has illegitimate children. Officers in the army are the fathers of most of these kids. And she uses her second in command to be the post that is occupied by her current lover. So you can see up here she has 21 prime ministers in 34 years of rule. And she uses that as the post that she puts her current amour in. But it was a very rigorous selection process that she did for these guys before they became her prime minister. A formal dinner to make sure they knew what spoon and what fork to use and all the rest of this stuff. Had to be, like a Renaissance man as far as intellect and grace is concerned. A medical exam by the court physician to make sure that there weren't any diseases of unpleasant nature, and then an intimate interview in her bedchamber. And if the man in question passed all this, he was then appointed prime minister until she got tired of it and went on to the next one. And then one of her illegitimate children, Paul, is going to take over when she finally passes away. And to give you an example, now we're going to get R-rated here for just a second. To give you an example of how infamous her reputation was, that it was an accepted story that the manner of her death involved a horse in the stable. And people believed this, and that story was actually published in history books as the cause of her death for years. Historians, while they may not doubt some of her habits, actually doubt that it was the cause of her death, even though she had experiences along those lines, evidently, when she was the ruler. Okay, last slide. I'm not going to beat you to death now or in the future with a long string of all the Russian rulers, but as we get into the 1800s, and we are on the doorstep of Nicholas II, when we finally get to the Russian Revolution in the early 20th century. We have Alexander. We're going to have a series of 3 Alexanders that are going to rule in the 1800s. We have Alexander the I. He kills his father, who is that Paul, the illegitimate son of Catherine. So he assassinates his. This is how Russia is. I mean, these are the kind of people who are ruling Russia. So he kills his dad, so he becomes the ruler, and he rules for 24 years. And then when Napoleon comes knocking on the doors in the early 1800s, he pretends he's dead and runs away because he didn't want to deal with Napoleon. And so he leaves Russia without a ruler for a period of time because he's afraid of what Napoleon will do to him. And he becomes a monk. And then Nicholas I takes over and is going to rule for 30 years. Okay, let me see. I think it is. That's the last one. There's a saying, it's good to be king because of all that comes to you. I think that any of us sitting in this room would like to think that if we were a ruler, that we'd be one of those people that you would call an enlightened ruler. Someone who is, wake up in the morning and say, what can I do for the good of my people today? As opposed to what we just mostly saw examples of here. But this is what happens in Europe for 300 years. And it's going to take them a while. There's going to be a revolution in virtually every European country. The big ones you hear about are England and France, of course. But there's going to be a revolution in every single European country to get this system off the books. And we'll get to that as we get deeper into the 19th, 18th, and 19th century. Okay, that's it. Again, I really appreciate you guys showing up. And we're going to try this again next month. God's willing, and the creeks will rise, and all that kind of thing. Okay? Thank you. Justin, do you have something you want to say?
Not necessarily. I just want to say it's great to see everyone. Thank you for coming out tonight. We've been trying to provide more activities that keep it safe and keep the quantities and limit of people to a safe amount. So it's just exciting to see everybody out and about. And obviously want to thank Colonel Johnston for putting this on, as always. Dinner will be out in about 5 or 10 minutes. The servers are going to walk around and just get drinks refilled, and feel free to take a bathroom break if you'd like, and then we'll get everybody served dinner. So thanks again for coming out.